Today's topic is the birth of sociology as a discipline. From Class 11 Sociology, Chapter 1, An Introduction to Sociology. Similar to how each one of us has our own biography and life story, every discipline has a biography as well. And through this video, we hope to learn the birth of sociology and its biography. To understand the history, we have to know the intellectual ideas that went into the making of sociology. And intellectual ideas refers to the thought processes and ideologies behind any theory, movement, or idea in general. So what are the intellectual ideas that went into the making of an entire discipline known as sociology? Let's understand the history first. The term sociology was coined by Auguste Comte in the year 1838. It was a hybrid word consisting of the Latin word socius, meaning companion, and the Greek word logos, meaning knowledge or study of. So, in other words, sociology was a study of companionship, or man in social groups. The aim of this discipline was to unify all the diverse social sciences, which had their own purview, and bringing them together into one single discipline. So all the social sciences, such as economics, political science, anthropology, psychology, history, etc., all of these were brought under one discipline which studies society as an interconnected whole. Sociology was a systematic study of society through a positivist lens. So Auguste Comte also established the positivist approach, which studied society through empirical data. And empirical data refers to the scientific method. It's a study conducted in an area based on collection and observation of data. And positivist methodology is not based on bias, prejudice, or naturalistic views, and that's why it's contrasted from theological, religious, and philosophical studies. Unlike these studies, sociology is not based on prejudices or previously established bias against any communities. A sociologist is free of any bias, and he studies society as it is, not what it ought to be. So this is what differentiated sociology between philosophical and religious studies and other naturalistic common sense based studies. It was only based on data, scientific method, and all the sociological observations and conclusions can be verified again by other people using the same scientific method. So that's why it's a systematic study of society. But what compelled Auguste Comte to start this discipline in the first place? Why did he suddenly feel like we had to study society differently? This can be attributed to the rapid tumultuous changes in Europe in the 18th and 17th centuries. The biggest change was the Industrial Revolution, which involved a transition from an agrarian-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy, in which the raw materials were transformed into more valuable finished goods through industrial manufacturing processes. The Industrial Revolution had several social impacts. There was growing urbanization from rural areas to cities. Cities were marked by smog, tall buildings, loud clanking sounds of machines, people moving around day and night to work, the continuous labor, slums, poverty, and acute discrimination between people. So people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and most of these communities that moved from rural areas to urban areas were the serfs, the peasants, because in the villages or the smaller towns, they were confined to guild restrictions or discrimination based on the feudal system. So they had to work for the kings and the lords anyways, or the vassals. So in other words, they had no better life opportunities in the rural areas, and in hope for improved facilities, reduced discrepancies and disparities among societies, and higher wages, economic development, access to education and healthcare, and just a better life in general, a lot of these peasants, they moved to urbanization, to urban cities. And little did they know that they were only moving to be exploited by the capitalists. So one of the biggest changes was urbanization. The next change was a rise in poverty. The workers were exploited by the capitalists. They had to work for 18 hours, put in multiple shifts. They didn't have access to proper housing, proper wages, and they led lives filled with inequalities and poverty, poor treatment. They didn't have access to 2 square meals a day, much rather access to education or healthcare. The bright future that they wished for their family was not fulfilled, and they were confined by the capitalists, who banked on exploiting through this labor. The next biggest change was unemployment. In the early days of industrialization, people had opportunity to work. However, with advancement in technology and transportation, mechanization took place, and machines could carry out the work that required 10 to 20 people. So this is why, at some point, unemployment was also on the rise. People couldn't find any work because machines were replacing them. This obviously led to exacerbation of poverty, and it also led to people taking up odd jobs or indignified jobs that risked their dignity and status in society and their prestige as well. And the biggest change is the new social order, which was divided people on the basis of their class. Earlier, it was based on their race, color, or their position in society based on royalty, members of the church, the estate system, or the feudal system. But the Industrial Revolution brought a class system based on capitalism and labor. So on the top of the pyramid, there were the capitalists who owned the means of production, and they were able to employ people to produce goods and services. And at the bottom of the pyramid were the laborers themselves, the peasants or the serfs, and they had nothing to offer except their hard work, their labor efforts. And so this system created inequalities, obviously, discrimination, and it also led to the marginalization and underprivileged people. And it was difficult for laborers to grow because for generations, the capitalists, they were not concerned about the welfare of the people as a whole. They were only concerned about gaining more property, gaining more wealth, and selling more goods and services. So at any cost, they were willing to exploit people and evade human rights as well. And so this new social order was different from what we saw in feudalism or casteism in India or any racial discrimination such as apartheid. So, and the reason being is that capitalism was not operated or owned by the feudal lords or the kings. It was operated by a new middle class or a merchant class, which emerged from, they grew and they were able to gain affluence through sea trade. They were merchants. And soon they began to control or monopolize the production in their own country as well. And usually the feudal lords, they were either liquidated, so they were given cash, or they became capitalists themselves. And so the intervention of the state and the government in economic activities were relatively low compared to what was before the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, the environmental impact is also to be considered. After the Industrial Revolution, the usage of coal increased significantly, and this led to rising greenhouse gases, although these terms weren't coined yet. So the environment was also being impacted. So there was these new cities, urban centers, that were characterized by slums, smog, buildings, the clanging sounds of machinery, etc. And when all of these philosophers observed this, they were confused as to how society changed so rapidly from an agrarian-based society where people were relatively equal, more or less, in some societies, and the production was largely based on the farms. There was no manufacturing whatsoever. whereas this industrial revolution brought a paradigm shift in the economy, which led to continuous repercussions in political and social spheres as well. Another major change in Europe was the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment period followed the Renaissance period, and this took place in the 17th and 18th centuries. So in the Renaissance period, it was the rebirth of society, and it provided emphasis on the arts, philosophy, culture, whereas the Enlightenment was a continuation of this Renaissance movement, but it focused on a resurgence of science, political thinking, and philosophy. It also focused on individualism, where every individual was entitled to his own opinions and he wasn't subject to a ruler or a despotic monarch or any tyrant. Every individual had the right to thought and the right to promulgate his views on society. Lastly, rational thinking. Earlier, people attributed God to everything. It was God that caused poverty, God that caused discrimination, God that caused death, God that caused birth. Whereas an emphasis on rational thinking led to advancement in science and respect for people. And people began to understand that they were the ultimate source of power, and God had minimal intervention. This is also where theories of atheism also emerged through rational thinking. So there is obviously a resurgence or a growth of rational thinking, and people began to question. And major change was inquisitive questioning nature. So instead of accepting every part of society as it was, people began to question why things were. Why was there discrimination? Why has there been a sudden change in what societies are? Why are there slums? Why is there poverty? Why are some people rich? Why are some people poor? People began to ask themselves these questions. And so this led to the development of several theories, and also it aided in the development of sociology as a discipline, because sociology is based on all of these principles: individualism, rational thinking, positivism, empirical data, philosophy slightly, and science, of course. The third major change in Europe was the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the first movement which led to the development of a nation-state, a state which was formed on the collective identity of the people, who had shared culture, shared norms, shared system of beliefs, and they all had a common identity, so there's a sense of belongingness. And one of the major impacts was these three foundational principles of modern democracies, which were liberty, equality, and justice. People were no longer subjects, they were citizens of a country. And every citizen was entitled to these essential, fundamental, inalienable rights. Liberty, which was the freedom to do anything that one chooses. Equality, which is fair treatment for everyone. And justice, which is being righteous and fair. Also, there's an emergence of social contract theory, which was an agreement between the people and their rulers. The ruler or the king was no longer the supreme authority. The command of the ruler wasn't law. And people began to understand that they were the ultimate source of all political, social, and economic power. Theories of liberalism, democracy, and a replacement of monarchy with a more people-focused or people-centric government emerged. And lastly, the theory of divinity was discarded. People began to understand that these oppressive rulers and tyrants such as Louis XVI or even Louis XIV, Henry VIII, they considered themselves to be the divine rulers. They were agents of God. But after the Enlightenment movement and growing industrialization, the middle class promoted the idea that these rulers were not related to God on any means. They are misusing their power to exert a monopoly over the entire state. So obviously there was revolts, protests, uproar, civil disobedience, And there's this new form of government based on the people's choice. And this is also known as democracy, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So why was sociology required? As you see here, as we've seen until this point, Europe witnessed rapid changes in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And this led to philosophers requiring a separate discipline that comprehended and studied these rapid changes and compare them with how previous non-industrialized societies under monarchs used to be. So to establish causal connections and relations between these previous societies and study society as an interconnected whole without the use of bias or prejudice, a new discipline known as sociology was born. And some early sociologists such as Auguste Comte, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, they believed that sociology had the power to bring welfare to the people and transform society for collective development as well. And they believed that sociology held the solution to poverty, unemployment, inequality, and other major issues being faced by the society. So sociology was also based on the ideas of humanism. And Auguste Comte himself was a humanist. And humanism believes that the origin of all history or any study in general should be society, humans. So if we're ever to understand any institutions or mechanisms of our world, the origin or the starting point should be studying society and humans. Sociology is also based on the ideas of humanism, and although this is beyond the syllabus, it's good to have a background on this theory as well. So that concludes this video on the birth of sociology as a discipline. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great learning experience. And until the next one, this is Nisha Tube signing off. Peace.